Hello, everybody. This is Wayne Bowen. I'm the program manager for the Pennsylvania Recycling Market Center and will serve as your moderator for today's webinar. This is the second National Recycling Coalition Quarterly Markets Development networking webinar. The third quarterly webinar will be scheduled sometime during the week of this September, so please keep an eye out for schedule updates. Our presenter today is Robin Wiener, who's the president of the Institute of Scrap Recycling Industries. Robin will provide an update of the impact of recycled commodities import restrictions imposed by the Chinese government over the last year. Following Robin's presentation, we will conduct a question and answer session. If you have a question or comment, please use the GoToWebinar dialog box located in the control panel on your screen. You may also use the dialog box to request assistance if you're experiencing technical difficulties during the webinar. Please note that an edited version of this webinar will be made available via YouTube links on the National Recycling Coalition and Pennsylvania Recycling Market websites. Just note the previous webinar is on both the websites right now with the YouTube links. And Robin's presentation slides can also be obtained using the handout upload feature on your webinar control panel. So I'm going to dispense of Robin's bio because I believe we have a long presentation in store for us and probably a lot of question and answers. So I'm going to defer the time for Robin. Okay, Robin, you're on.
Great. Thank you very much, Wayne. And welcome everyone to this webinar. And as I was trying to think what all of you would be interested in hearing, I decided to include some of the information from the last webinar. Not a lot, but a little bit as an overview and to give everyone context, especially for those of you who may not have participated in the first webinar. So I am going to start with a very quick background on Isre and a snapshot of the recycling industry today, and then talk about the roles of US and China in the global recycling market, some of the market shifts we've seen over the last several months as a result of the Chinese import restrictions, talk a bit about the supply chain, which I didn't do last time, here in the US and how that has affected recycling given the trigger of China, and also some of the other factors that affect the health of the recycling industry, because I think that's very important as we all work together to develop solutions and other efforts to further strengthen the entire recycling chain. We need to understand what's underlying that. So I thought that would be helpful to share. Talk then about some of the latest actions coming out of China, which are changing literally daily. I just found out this morning about something new that was just issued yesterday by China Customs, and I'll share with you. And then some of the compounding challenges. And when I say compounding challenges, I'm talking about other actions in Southeast Asia, as well as actions here in the US and the effects of the US-China trade war. And then some of the responses that we've already seen with regard to efforts on the part of a number of stakeholders to address the issues that have occurred, as well as some of the long-term efforts that we all need to be engaged in. So with that, let me just very quickly, for those of you who aren't aware, talk about Isre. We are the trade association representing the scrap recycling industry. Our members are across all the major scrap commodities. We have approximately 1,300 members all throughout North America and around the world. About 80% of our members are based in the United States. Our mission is very straightforward. We work to promote safe, economically sustainable, and environmentally responsible recycling through networking, advocacy, and education. In terms of the recycling industry itself, the scrap recycling industry, we process over 130,000 tons of scrap each and every year, and that's material coming from a variety of sources. And again, I'll talk about the sources in a little bit. And you can see the volumes of the various commodities that the industry processes in a given year. These numbers are based on the previous year, and they are presented in our latest yearbook, which is dated 2017. We're actually going to be issuing a new yearbook within the next 2 to 3 months. All of this is available on our website, and there's a lot more detail on our website at isre.org if you're looking for any specific data with regard to trade flows, jobs, economic activity, et cetera, if we do it on an international level as well as state by state and even within states. So, and if you have any trouble locating it, please let me know. I didn't want to spend a lot of time on that data on this webinar, but it is all available online. What I did think it was very important to do, though, is, again, as part of the context, talk about how the U.S. industry fits into the global industry, because understandably, a lot of people, when they think about recycling here in the U.S., they think about that blue bin at the end of the driveway. It's a very local activity. But the truth is, recycling is a global activity. There is movement of scrap around the world. We ship in any given year to more than 150 different countries worldwide, to paper mills, steel mills, foundries, plastic refiners, et cetera, around the world. It is estimated that approximately 800 million metric tons are consumed globally of scrap commodities. And actually, our member organization, BIR, the Bureau of International Recycling in Brussels, reports that about 40% of manufacturing input globally is dependent upon scrap commodities. Now, because of supply and demand dynamics, scrap will flow to where the demand is. And that's not always in the country where it's generated. And so it's estimated that about 180 million metric tons annually of scrap or recyclable secondary materials move around the world. Now, in terms of who the key players are, they are the United States and China. With the U.S. as the largest generator and the largest exporter of processed scrap in the world. China has been, up until this year, the largest importer. So you can see why the health of one affects the health of the other. And if there are actions taken by one of the two countries affecting scrap flows, it's going to affect the other. As I already mentioned, we ship to more than 150 different countries around the world. This past year, we shipped to 155 countries, and we shipped 37 million metric tons. In terms of the volume of scrap that China imported last year, it was 43 million metric tons. We were the largest supplier, but we are certainly not the only supplier. So this is a worldwide issue. I also wanted to give you this snapshot, which I don't think I had last time, of what's happened with regard to the export of scrap out of the U.S. to China, and how has it trended over the last 25 years. You can see that the real buildup occurred in the early 2000s, so almost 20 years ago, and it was a steady rise. Why? Because China was rapidly industrializing, and there was the rise of the middle class within China. So you had consumption, you had construction, you had lots of activity demanding raw materials, and China is resource poor. Not only did they not have their own scrap generation or their own stockpile of scrap, but they also didn't have the virgin materials at the volume they needed. So they were heavily dependent and have been heavily dependent upon the import of scrap across all the various commodity lines. We did start seeing a decline around 2012, but the real rapid decline certainly has been this year as a result of the actions which we'll talk about in a minute. And this is just a quick picture, a snapshot based on the first 4 months of the year. So comparing January through April 2017 through January to April 2018. We do use data out of the U.S. Department of Commerce and other governmental sources, and there is a bit of a delay in getting that data, which is the reason why we're reporting through April right now. But you can see the hardest hit, and no surprise, is plastic scrap, a decline of literally more than 92% year over year. Certainly, some of the metals were hit as well. Nickel, stainless, and alloy scrap down 53%. Recovered paper and fiber down 37%. Now, this will further, this curve, to the extent of the curve, will continue to evolve over the next year, because We have different deadlines coming up for extension of the ban and to other commodities. So, for example, I would expect the copper scrap number in about 9 months to look a lot different. It'll be unfortunately, a lot higher. So there will be significant changes that will occur over the next year and further down the road. So what I want to do here is talk a little about the sources of scrap. And the reason why that's important to understanding that chain here in the U.S. is because some of the weaknesses that we're seeing in the recycling infrastructure that were triggered by what's happening in China are due to sourcing issues. And so I want to make sure we all understand what those issues are. Scrap certainly is sourced from a multitude of places. There are many different categories, but the main categories are commercial, industrial, and residential. And I'm lumping commercial industrial together for the purposes of this presentation because they're very similar. Commercial, we're talking about like retail operations, et cetera. Commercial and industrial sources represent about 60 to 70% of recyclables across the country. Now, again, this is not commodity specific, so the percentages may vary depending if we're talking about paper, plastics, or metals, but this is a rough estimate. And generally, when these materials enter the recycling process, they are source separated. So they're at the source where they're generated. They're generally separated into their specification grade or close to it, so that it's generally clean. This is clean material, very little cross-contamination. Then you have the residential stream. The residential stream represents about 30 to 40% of scrap supplies in the United States. Again, the specific percentage will vary depending upon the commodity, but that's an overall rough percentage. And this is where we're really seeing the challenge. I have to tell you that as I see articles in the general press about recycling, and I hate even saying this out loud, but recycling is dead, or recycling is dying, or recycling in crisis. What we're really talking about are challenges although there are weaknesses throughout, the real challenges we're seeing are coming out of the sourcing from the residential. And why is that? It's because of the contamination levels. And why are we seeing these contamination levels? That I've seen reported contamination levels of more than 30%, as high as 40% in some cases. I believe that it's due to a number of different there's a number of different factors. It's not just one, so there isn't a panacea that's going to solve this for all of us. There's certainly confusion as to what can be put in the bin. There's what we've all heard about and we've witnessed with regard to wish cycling. A lot of the general public has received the message that if you're not sure if something should be recycled, just put it in the bin. The recyclers will figure it out. There's also a lot of different models out there for the collection systems, how the material gets into the bin and gets to the MRF or the recycler. You've got dual stream in some localities still. There's the movement that's occurred over the last 20 years to single stream. And even in some cases, we have some isolated communities where there's one bin or mixed waste processing, recycling or collection rather, that's occurring. And then there's the issues in the recycling infrastructure itself. For those MRFs and recyclers that were sourcing out of the residential stream, they developed over the last 20 years and invested in the last 20 to 30 years based on their largest customer and the needs of their largest customer. And then that largest customer was China. And China was buying the material that had the higher contamination level. Why? Because that was what they took into the country and they processed within the country, did the further processing to then get to the higher grades, which then shipped to the manufacturer. And obviously what's happening now is China's saying no more to that. They only want the higher grades. So let's shift to what are those factors that affect the health of the recycling supply chain? Certainly, as I just said, that contamination, quality. quality is a key issue and factor in the strength of recycling. If quality breaks down, you're going to see a breakdown in recycling, because recycling doesn't occur until the manufacturer can, or the end industrial consumer actually can use the material, can take it into their process. And if they can't because the quality is too low, regardless of how well the collection went, recycling has not occurred. And that's the breakdown that we're having right now. Now, one of the key resources that's out there is Isre scrap specifications. It's been used for more than 80 years globally and contains hundreds of specifications for all the different grades of scrap for each of the various commodities. And that is what contains the allowable tolerances for prohibitives and contaminants for each of those grades. And these specs have been developed after careful consideration between recyclers and consumers, the industrial consumers. The specifications are used globally, but they're not used everywhere. And that's what we saw in China. The Chinese government went their own way with the carried waste standard, and that has caused a lot of the confusion and a lot of problems we're facing. However, a lot of governments do use the Isre specs. As a matter of fact, and I think I mentioned this last time, the Indian government, the government of India, actually has adopted the Isre specs in their customs clearance procedures, so nothing can enter India unless it meets one of the Isre specs. So we work very actively with our counterparts in India on revisions and updates needed to the guidelines and the specifications at all times, and we welcome that input from consumers around the world. It is the primary source of specifications in the United States and throughout North America, and again in other parts of the world. Now, there are a lot of other factors, though, that affect the health of the recycling industry and the recycling stream throughout the world. The recycling is sensitive to a number of factors. Certainly, U.S. personal consumption and spending, which affect both scrap generation and consumption. Industrial production and manufacturing output here in the U.S. as well as globally, also a major factor. Certainly, volatility in commodity prices. Transportation and energy costs. They have both had a significant impact on the operational costs of recycling and thus the economics of recycling. And I would just note that backhauling, which I don't think we've talked about before, but backhauling was actually one of the factors that contributed to the attractiveness of China as a market. And that's something important for us to keep in the back of our mind, because as we look to alternative markets, transportation costs play even a bigger role than they did for China, because China, with so much export coming out of China of consumer goods, you have containers moving into the U.S. and they're empty going back. And so over the years, the practice of backhauling has occurred where shippers, the container companies have reduced costs for the shipment of goods back to China. We don't have that phenomena in India and in other parts of the world. So that does mean that our transportation costs are going to be higher to some of these alternative markets. Certainly policy developments play a major role as well. And then, no surprise, artificial manipulation of the market that's been triggered by tariffs and other protectionist measures that we're seeing more and more of throughout the world. I should note also, I've got a snapshot on the slide of our scrap specification circular. I would welcome everyone going. If you haven't seen it, you're not familiar with it, please take a look at it. It's on our website. If you have any problems finding it, just let me know. It is updated regularly, constantly being updated so it reflects the needs of the market. And if there are issues that you see, I'd welcome feedback on it. Okay, so I want to revisit for a minute the issue of what's driving the changes coming out of China, because that helps us as we look at solutions going forward. Again, no surprise, and we talked about this extensively last time, about the severe environmental crisis that China is facing right now. It's been given a number of different labels over the last couple of years. Most recently, they used the phrase beautiful China, the goal to create a beautiful China, as well as to create blue skies throughout China. And those are just catchwords for the very serious effort across all industries that China has taken over the last several years under President Xi to clean up the environment. But what I want to emphasize this time, which I didn't talk about as much last time, is the role of Chinese protectionism. Because as we're seeing new initiatives come out of China over the last few months, and also we're hearing rumors of what's coming next, it's very clear that the real underlying driver here is the desire of the Chinese leadership to eliminate their dependence on imported resources. And some of you may remember that last time I talked about China's multi-pronged strategy and the six-part strategy they issued last July. It's on our website as well, for how they were going to address recycling, which includes imports, but also domestic. And the second priority they mentioned is the desire to halt imports that can be replaced with domestic resources by the end of 2019. They certainly signaled in that document that protectionism was a factor. But as we look at what they're adding now into further bans and the steps they're taking, it's very clear to me that government policy is driving this through protectionist measures. And so we're also seeing significant investment occurring by the Chinese government in their own domestic recycling infrastructure with an emphasis on urban collection systems. Okay, so what are those actions that China's taking? Well, I think we're all familiar with what's happened through March with regard to the notifications, the new standards for carried waste, their bans that became effective on January 1st, and then the effective date for carried waste, which is in March 1st. But there's been a lot of activity since then, beginning on April 19th, when they announced a number of additional bans. They intend by the end of this year to ban post-industrial plastics, compressed auto pieces, small electric motors, insulated wires, steel slag, and vessels by the end of 2019. So by the end of next year, stainless steel scrap, non-ferrous scrap, excluding aluminum and copper, and wood pallets. And you look at that list, especially the one that stands out for me is stainless steel scrap, some of the cleanest scrap there is. And so clearly this is protectionist in nature. I'd also mention that one of the activities that Isre has been very active in over the last several months and earlier has been trying to get clarity on these, because some of these terms don't match up to the Isre specs and what most of the world uses to define the various grades of scrap. And that's caused a lot of confusion. The best example is compressed auto pieces. We don't know what that means. Is that a flattened car? Is it the ferrous that comes out of the shredding process? There's so many different options of what it could be, and no one's really clear what it means. Again, it tells us all, again, the importance of consistent global standards. Then on May 3rd, they have been, that was when Chinese Customs announced suspension of CCIC-NA for 1 month. CCIC-NA is currently the only authorized inspection agency for pre-shipment inspection within the U.S. And CCIC is the global entity, so it's used in countries around the world, and it is the only authorized global entity as well. The Chinese government did announce earlier this year that they were going to allow and authorize other inspection agencies, but they've yet to do that. So CCIC is the only inspection agency. So therefore, what happens when they suspend CCIC? It means all shipments come to a halt, because nothing can be exported into China without a pre-shipment inspection. CCIC-NA is based in LA. They have offices, though, in New York and I believe Chicago. They are responsible for all pre-shipments in the United States and in Mexico. There is a CCIC-NA office in Canada that was allowed to continue operations, but the others were not. The reason for this action, we're told, we've heard two different things. Ostensibly, based on what the Chinese government has said officially, is that it was because of problems with procedures that CCIC was following. And this is consistent with what we're seeing at a higher level within China in terms of a reorganization and an attempt to centralize control throughout the government. And around the same time, they moved AQSIQ into customs. There no longer is an AQSIQ that was issuing the regs for licenses before. CCIC is now being further controlled by customs, and customs is exerting its control. We've also heard rumors that customs out of Beijing is making its presence known at ports throughout China right now, so not relying on the local inspectors anymore. There was also some discussion and one rumor going around that there was one shipment that was problematic that entered from the U.S. that may have caused the issue, but we don't know. I think the larger issue is really an issue with CCIC. There was some uncertainty as whether or not the 1-month prohibition would go beyond the month. Luckily, it didn't. There was, about a week before the prohibition ended, an opening that they gave CCIC out of Canada to inspect U.S. shipments, but because of the backlog, there was no way that Canada could have handled them anyway. So it really, I don't think it had any impact. There is still a significant backlog as a result of the 1-month stoppage on all shipments. And there's also other delays being caused by some new procedures that were announced at the end of May for pre-inspection. It used to be that you could get the inspection done by sharing photographs of the containers. Now it actually has to be an in-person inspection. And there's, I want to say, approximately 50 inspectors around the country, but there are many more operations, recycling operations that are shipping to China than 50, and they're spread all around the country. And so there's timing issues of getting an inspector to your yard. It's also very expensive now because the recycler has to pay for the travel costs of getting the inspector to their yard, as well as their hourly fees. I think it's about $60 an hour. And those, the hours start, the clock starts when the travel starts. So this is significantly added to the logistics costs for moving containers into China. We're also incidentally hearing reports of what's happening on the other end at the arrival port. There's much more thorough inspections. They're unloading every container and literally doing visual as well as more intensive inspections of all the scrap in the containers. So that's also causing further backlogs. A little bit of good news. There was some clarity that came out of China also in May, where they announced that they'll accept imports of recycled PET in flake form. This also followed what we heard, but we still haven't seen in writing, which is that pellets can be imported. And the reason is interesting, because it's not covered by the solid waste import regime. Pellets are not solid waste. The ban applies to solid waste. Scrap is solid waste. Pellets are solid waste. Or pellets rather, not solid. Pellets are scrap. So we've got a bit of a circular here. And so I think the real question that we're all left with, and I know from Isre's perspective, the real priority for us now is figuring out what's in and what's out. What kinds of scrap do the Chinese not consider solid waste? And can therefore ship regardless of new requirements to come out, new bans, etc. And certainly the preliminary conclusion that we're coming to based on what little is coming out of China is that what they want is that manufacture-ready, mill-ready, melt-ready scrap can move into China. They want all the pre-processing or the processing from lower to higher grade to occur within the exporting country. I was going to say the latest announcement, but now the next to latest announcement came out last week or in the last 2 weeks, and that was the statement of the Chinese of their intention to eliminate solid waste imports by 2020. And there are a couple of very important things that I want to mention about this. First of all, again, they're using the term solid waste. If pellets aren't solid waste, does that mean that pellets will still move after that? What are other shredded scrap, shredded ferrous scrap? Does that move after 2020 because it's not solid waste? So we're trying to figure all of this out right now, and I would assume, like anything else out of China, there will not be a quick answer, and it won't be easy to get regardless. There's also conflicting information in the statement that came out of China. First of all, it is not a rule, a law, regulation, etc. This is a statement about where they think they're headed. And I'm going to read you the exact language, actually, that came out of that statement. It says, the state shall completely forbid the foreign garbage from entering into China, crack down the smuggling of the foreign garbage, and then this is interesting, sharply decrease the types and quantity of the imported solid waste, and strive to basically achieve the zero impact of solid waste by the end of 2020. There's conflicting information in there, and also the language is saying, the language of striving. Again, they would have to go through a new set of rules before this took place, and they're also nowhere near self-sufficiency right now to be able to do this effectively anyway, we believe, by the end of 2020. Actually, going back, I mentioned that one other rule that or announcement that came out of China was actually we heard about it this morning. It was announced yesterday out of Customs. It was a new announcement where they announced restrictions on the ports of entry for scrap imports. I haven't had a chance yet to read the rule, but it doesn't take effect until January 1st of 2019. And we will be sending information to all of our members once we've analyzed the announcement, and we'll certainly have it on our website as well. Okay, so what are the other challenges that are affecting the flow of recyclables within the U.S. and globally? Certainly the U.S.-China trade war. We're seeing tariffs being imposed on key imports from each country, which is introducing further uncertainty and volatility into the markets. From the U.S. side, the U.S. government imposed tariffs that were announced earlier this month. I'm pleased to say that we were able to get several products related to recycling machinery off the list that were originally on it. But unfortunately, we still did see shredder castings imported from China, which represents a fair volume. And it's a 25% tariff on this material, so it will impact the cost of shredding, scrap shredding. We have well over 200 shredders around the country that are shredding automobiles, appliances, and other heavy scrap, and generate the vast majority of ferrous that's feeding our steel mills around the country and around the world. We also have heard of another list that the U.S. government's developing, which includes special purpose machinery, and so that will include, or special purpose motor vehicles, which will include, we think, sweepers, mobile cranes, material handlers, and a number of other pieces of equipment that are used in recycling and MRF operations. And so that's something that we're looking at right now. On the Chinese side, back in April, in the first wave of retaliatory actions, aluminum scrap exports out of the U.S. Were caught. And so there's now a 25% tariff on aluminum scrap coming out of the U.S. And it's interesting to note that the U.S. supplied 50% of China's total imports of aluminum scrap last year. And so we estimate that's about a $300 million price burden right now in our trade relationship. Another issue to mention as a result of the U.S.-China trade war is it's just making dialogue very difficult between our two countries. Whereas in the past, we continue to reach out to the Chinese government, both through the representatives here in Washington as well as in Beijing. It's much more difficult now to have the kind of dialogue that would be needed to really make a difference. And so hopefully this will change going forward. Okay, so we are seeing diversion of some of the trade into Southeast Asia. And a lot of that is occurring because a number of Chinese operations have moved into Southeast Asia. So those recyclers have moved into Southeast Asia and set up operations to take in the material they once took in within China. But there's a problem associated with that. First of all, the infrastructure in these countries isn't necessarily set up to take in the high volumes that have started to flow in. And as a result, the countries are instituting bans and new license requirements, inspection requirements, et cetera. And then there's also the problem that, unfortunately, actually in reports I just saw earlier today out of Thailand, that one of the reasons that they're looking at bans, and Thailand just announced a ban on plastic scrap and electronic scrap coming into the country, is because of the poor recycling practices of the Chinese that have moved into the country. And that just reinforces what was really underlying, one of the issues that was underlying the Chinese actions, which is that there was a problem with a number of these, what I'll call pre-processors, pre-recyclers within China that were accepting a lot of the material coming out of the U.S. A lot of them were great operations, state-of-the-art, but a lot of them weren't. And that is one of the things that triggered the intense enforcement actions that have occurred within China. Okay, so what's happening here in the U.S. as a result of all of this? Certainly, we're seeing some investment being made here in the U.S., which is a good thing, both in terms of employment as well as capital investment. And that's being made by recyclers, but it's also being made by Chinese. They're not only moving into Southeast Asia, they're also moving into the U.S., hoping to process here and then ship their mill-ready grades into China. Some of the MRFs, the single-stream MRFs, are slowing down their sorting lines and adding optical sorters or additional people on the sorting lines in order to attack the contamination problem, but obviously that's costly, and not all the MRFs have the room or the ability to do that. There's the exploration of new markets. Touched on that a little bit with Southeast Asia, but India is also a very important market, and India certainly wants this material. There are transportation issues, as I mentioned earlier, but India is very much of a growing market for us. As a matter of fact, just earlier this week, we entertained the representatives of one of the ports in southern India that's courting the business. We're also talking with the Indian government in August. We're going to be in Delhi talking with them about the development of their recycling policy. There's a lot of potential there, but certainly in the short term, no one's going to replace the large volumes that were coming out of China, or going into China rather. We're seeing some material stockpiling. Also, some municipalities are reacting by eliminating materials going through their systems or having temporary suspensions. And then interestingly, I'm sure everyone has seen California entertaining the proposed AB 3178, which would relax their mandatory recycling goals. It's really critical, though, for us to see long-term solutions, that we need sustained efforts. These can't be short-term efforts. And some of these efforts can only be sustained for short term. So we need to look at those efforts that will have the impact long term. And one of the highest priorities, as I've mentioned quality a number of times, is addressing the quality of the recyclables that are entering the stream. Just in the last few months, Isre announced through its specs zero tolerance guidelines for recovered fiber. And we're doing our best to communicate that information out to all stakeholders. As I mentioned again, it's on our website, but I've quoted here the new zero tolerance definition, as well as some clarity that's been added to the prohibited materials definition. Several years ago, Isre introduced guidelines for inbound curbside recyclables for MRFs. We are in the process of, we'll probably be updating them yet again, but I encourage you to take a look at that information. We're also working with the Association of Plastics Recyclers and Sorting Protocol to evaluate how 2D and 3D designed items behave on conveyors to help MRFs better capture those inbound materials. certainly we all need to work together, and we need to communicate on a regular basis what the needs are of the buyer, using certainly the specs as a guide, but also factoring in the local market issues and the local issues that all of you who are municipalities have to deal with every day. There's a need for increased public education and awareness to improve household efforts to separate trash from the recyclables, including giving them clear guidance on what can be recycled, how to clean food containers, and the need to avoid recycling. We need to look at also programs for increasing demand because that will drive further recycling. Isre has its own design for recycling program. I know there are efforts that other organizations have as well. We work very closely with a number of manufacturing industries to highlight the importance of designing products with recycling in mind. There's also the Remade Institute, which actually I'm surprised hasn't gotten more press. It was started in the last year, although it's been in the works for several years. It's an effort led by the Department of Energy, but it's in partnership with about 50 different organizations around the country, including Isre, and its focus is driving advanced manufacturing. And the focus is sustainability and recyclability, and I'm really excited about the potential of that entity to help drive some of the solutions for recycling down the road. We also have a collaboration with the Plastics Industry Association in creating markets for TPO plastic auto bumper covers. APR has its Recycling Demand Champions program, which is focused on mixed plastics. And I know I have not listed what everyone's doing, but it's just a snapshot of some of the things that are going on right now, but more needs to be done. We also need to rethink packaging and product design. And that requires, at its fundamental, a common definition that we're all using as to what is recyclable. It's not enough that a product can be technically, but I say technically recyclable. You also have to factor in the economics and the logistics of that material entering the stream and potential contamination and whether or not it's economical through that stream to be able to get it to where it needs to be. And so we need to be careful when we say what's recyclable, that it's something that we all agree on. And that does require engagement and dialogue with all the stakeholders. And we need recyclers and manufacturers to work together. And again, I think Remade plays a role here as well. There's also a need for unified global standards. As I mentioned, the Isre specs are probably as close as exists throughout the world on a global standard, but it's still not everywhere. We're working very hard to get it everywhere, but outside the U.S., there are still some pockets where it's not used, and so that's something we're pushing very heavily. For example, in the EU, they have a series of standards, the EN 643, and others focused on recovered paper. And although they're similar, they're not identical, and so that's something that we need to work on. And I'm sure there are others out there as well. Also, communities have to decide where they're going to pay for increased costs, because they can't be avoided. Is it going to be paid for at the collection through shifts away from one bin and single stream, or in the contracts with the MRFs and the recyclers to compensate for the higher processing costs? I think actually an important note to leave this section on is our conclusion, at least, is this is not something that there's going to be a reversal of. China isn't going to open up their doors again. We are seeing a fundamental transformation in the markets right now, and we all have to look long-term for solutions. And I would say that the most important factor in all of this, the most important need, is really for all of us to have that dialogue and talking to each other, because no one entity in the stream, no one set of stakeholders can solve the problem for everyone else. Recycling is a chain that involves many parts, and if any one part of it falters, it all falters. And so it's critical that we all are working together. And this conversation is going to continue, will continue in a number of different forums. There's an important forum coming up that I want to make sure everyone's aware of. towards the end of August, SWANA has their WasteCon, and during WasteCon, we have partnered with SWANA on a MRF Summit, where a lot of this discussion will occur. We're very excited because it will be the one place where we're going to be bringing all the stakeholders together, community representatives, municipalities, the recyclers, the MRFs, hopefully the brand owners, manufacturers, to talk about what are the challenges we're all facing and what are the solutions we can all work on together. So we would welcome your involvement and your participation in that program, and I've included the discount code. So if you want to save some money, you can use the code Isre 2018 to save $200 on your registration. So we really hope that we'll see many of you there. And with that, I'd love to answer any and all questions people have.
Okay, thank you, Robin. We're now going to field some questions. If you have a question, please enter them on the GoToWebinar dialog box. So we already have a few questions already, and I'm going to take them in order as they came in. So some may have been addressed on later slides, Robin, but I'm just going to repeat them.
Sure.
So the first one is, how can they possibly eliminate dependence on fiber from others when they have few trees to harvest in large amounts? Do they intend to completely deforest Southeast Asia?
It is a great question. It's obviously the question we've all been asking ourselves. We're starting, there are a couple of things that they're doing. Certainly, they've been shifting to a certain extent to virgin resources, and that has its own environmental concerns. But over the short term, that's something that they're looking at. And we've seen Nine Dragons announce they actually purchased 2 mills here in the U.S. So we are seeing more production out of China shifting to other countries, and we've heard of plans of the Chinese to set up operations here in the States to generate pulp and to ship it then to China. So but that will take time. So there has definitely been a price effect within China. I know there have been a lot of complaints in the official Chinese newspaper. There have been statements critical of the big paper mills for price hikes, but I think that's a natural effect of what's happened.
Okay. So I have a follow-up question. So in theory, the 2 plants that might open in the United States owned by China may see scrap generated from domestic sources go to those plants instead of going all the way to China. Okay.
I would think so. Again, we have not heard specific plans, but I would imagine that is possible. We've also heard of mills opening up in Southeast Asia with Chinese owners, so perhaps some of the mixed paper may end up going to those mills, but it's going to take, I would imagine, at least a year or 2 for a lot of these to get up and running. So unfortunately, it will be painful until then.
Okay, I'm not sure if you can answer this. This is sort of a political question. How much of this is targeted at just disrupting the market and or saving face by no longer importing foreign garbage to prove they are now a first world major player versus the real demand for especially paper and fiber and metals?
It is an interesting question, and I'll try my best to answer it. My sense, based on everything I've read and and from when I've been in China, is that there are multiple factors that are driven what China has done. Most fundamentally, they do have an environmental crisis on their hands, and they have been looking at every industrial sector to clean up their operations. And recycling is just part of that process. Now, why did they look at the imports? I think there's a number of reasons for that. Imports are part of what they're doing. It is a piece. It's not the whole thing, but it obviously is a piece that affects us most. There was concern over social upheaval, and as a matter of fact, and I mentioned this at during our last call, they even specifically called this out in their multi-pronged strategy that they are it's actually the number one, the first prong of the strategy was to prohibit the import of solid waste with major environmental hazards and intense public reaction. And there was a lot of intense public reaction when the documentary Plastics China first aired in China. And there were some very high-profile cases of some contaminated loads that came into China that caused a lot of issues and protests. So that is also a factor. I would imagine part of that question is also how much the relationship with the U.S. and the U.S.-China trade war is affecting this. This would have happened even without that, but that trade war has made finding a solution, I think, that much harder.
Is there a specific list of paper types and grades and plastics that are being banned by China?
Yes, and we have that information on our website, and to the extent that we all understand what the categories mean, what they're referring to, we have that information as well.
Okay, here's a two-part question. A lot of residential recycling contamination is certainly due to wishful recycling, like consumers putting coat hangers, diapers, lumber, and textiles in their bins. And when we get that, we need to fix it. But also some standard recyclables cause most of the contamination, such as glass, styrofoam, plastic bags, and many other things that some municipalities previously encouraged. Now it is difficult to retrain and educate residents to take those things out of their bins. Does Isre have any ideas or best practices for dealing with glass and plastic bags?
That's a great question, and I certainly agree with what was said, and certainly one of the things we're working on right now is some public-facing information on our website and spreading the information in other ways about what homeowner has to do and where they should take their plastic bags and what other good practices there are, and encouraging homeowners to look to their municipality as to what the guidelines are for their specific recycling program. And we welcome the opportunity to work with municipalities to find solutions, because I think we're all grappling with this problem. But I agree with the general assessment of what the problem is.
Could you clarify what you mean by poor actors moving from China to elsewhere in Southeast Asia, and what would be an example of bad practices?
Sure, I'll do my best. I would say that, like with any industry, there are some players that do it right and others that don't follow the norm in terms of what I would call just responsible recycling, which is operating in a safe manner and in compliance and even beyond compliance with environmental laws. And unfortunately, there were a number of entities that were not doing what needed to be done in terms of operating a safe and environmentally responsible facility. So, I could use some examples from the U.S. in terms of all the requirements we have for stormwater management and other controls to make sure that contaminants don't flow into surrounding waterways and into the soil. And those protections are not at those kinds of facilities, that the bad actors aren't using those kinds of protections.
So do you have any examples of temporary program suspensions of recycling, and what is the public reaction?
I don't have them listed in front of me, but I know that actually one of the best sources I've seen is Waste Dive. Waste Dive has that 50-state compilation that they provide in each issue of their newsletter, and a lot of the specific programs are provided. That information is provided in there, and I have them in my files. I just don't have them in front of me now, and I'd be happy if whoever is asking the question, if they want to separately email me, I can pull it up and share it with them.
Okay, this one's a comment on AB 3178, and they say it doesn't relax recycling goals, it clarifies existing policy, that one of the factors in considering a good faith effort to implement state laws includes market considerations.
And that's fair. And when I say relax, I mean it's that good faith effort, which I think my understanding, at least, of what was happening with the recycling, the mandated recycling goals in California prior, was there was no allowance for good faith efforts. But I understand the comment.
Okay, this one has to do with e-waste. Can you give any suggestions for U.S. e-waste recyclers to recycle post-industrial plastics, especially e-plastics, domestically in the U.S.?
There are a number of recyclers around the country that are processing that material. If that person can actually email me offline, I'd be happy to talk about it.
Okay, good. Is there a coordinated national effort being developed to promote the message of recycle right? All programs need that as a backdrop for more specific guidance from local governments.
I couldn't agree more about the need to do that. I am not aware of a formal coordinated national effort. I will tell you that from the association perspective, a lot of us are talking to each other and are attempting to work across association lines to develop more nationwide programs. So there are a lot of efforts behind the scenes on that, but there's nothing formal yet that I'm aware of.
Okay,
and I think part of the problem with that, let me just say, part of the problem, and I don't know how to get around this, is the problem that what does it mean to recycle right varies by local community. So that's the challenge I think anyone has in pulling together a national program.
Okay, here's another two-part question. What is Isre doing, and what have they done over the recent past to educate our state and national lawmakers about how they can help? And is China open to listening to Isre or other trade organizations about why they need our commodities?
First question, we work very closely through our chapters, talking on a regular basis to the various state policymakers, and we work through, we have a lot of cooperative efforts with NCSL, the National Council of State Legislators. We're actually going to be at their big conference in August, where we host actually almost like a mini trade show during the lunch, where we have a lot of the materials on exhibit, and it allows us to create a dialogue with the hundreds, thousands of state legislators that are there. And so, yes, we do have an ongoing conversation with state policymakers. Having said that, I'm sure we're not hitting everyone, and I welcome any sort of extension on that dialogue. With regard to how welcoming China is to a dialogue from Isre and from others, I'd say it's getting tougher. As I've mentioned in the previous webinar, I'm in China relatively frequently, and certainly in our last visit, which was the end of April, we didn't get into any government offices. Now, I would say there's two reasons. Primarily, internally within China, they're going through a restructuring of all of their government offices. So until that settles out, and we were told it may not settle out for another month or two, I think they were wary with meeting with anyone. Having said that, we have been in to see AQSIQ, which no longer exists, as well as other government agencies within China in the past, to talk about the important role the commodities play. But it is getting tougher because of this tension between the U.S. and China.
Okay. You might have mentioned this, but I'll ask it anyway. What's the new thing that you found out this morning?
Oh, that was the announcement out of Customs from yesterday, whereby they have restricted the ports of entry for scrap imports, and it will not take effect until January 1st, 2019. But we are in the process right now of going through that announcement, getting it officially translated, and as soon as we do that, which should be within the next couple of days, we'll have that up on our website.
Okay. Do you foresee a shift back away from single stream recycling to more of a source separated collection?
I would actually, I'm probably not the best person to ask that question. I'm not in the position to answer that. I would actually love to hear answers from all the folks that are on the call to that question, because I'm wondering the same thing. On the one hand, there's been tremendous investment made by governments around the country into the single stream structure. So it would be very difficult to move away from it. Having said that, that's clearly a solution, or not a panacea, but it certainly would help. But there is, that structure is in place already, so I don't know if it's going to happen, but I would love feedback from others in terms of what they think on that question.
Okay, this is a bit of a hardball. China has signaled since 2010 these kinds of regs would be coming. Has the U.S. industry been too complacent in recognizing what would happen?
I mean, that's certainly, it is a hardball, but it's one that we've hit before. I think what was no one's surprised, I think, on the plastic side. Where we were surprised was on the other commodities. The commodities that we know are in high demand and were being shipped without contamination issues. And so that came as a surprise, how comprehensive the program was, certainly from National Sword and all these programs that started, which was a little bit after 2010, we would expect that there would be continued tightening on plastics, but not for the other commodities.
Okay. Is Isre helping to promote the idea that recycling is infrastructure too in Congress, and that the U.S. could adopt policies and programs like Ellison's bill, H.R. 1034, to bring recycling jobs to America?
I can't comment specifically on Ellison's bill, but I can say that in general, we've been very active in the infrastructure debate. Unfortunately, the infrastructure debate has died down. I don't know that we're going to see infrastructure reform we're not going to see infrastructure reform this year, but certainly anytime there's any sort of talk about infrastructure reform, we're there on the Hill, and we've brought proposals in terms of how recycling should be considered and integrated into infrastructure development to the Hill, and we'll continue to do that.
Isre's policy is to support EPR only for materials for which there aren't well-functioning free markets. Does that now include mixed paper and 3 through 7 plastics from curbside programs? Should Isre revise its EPR policy in light of the market changes? Recycle BC, for example, reports fewer market issues as a result of China than non-EPR jurisdictions.
Isre's policy on EPR goes back many years, and it's reflective of our philosophy that the market should be allowed to function freely, except when there's an emerging market that needs still some support before it can be self-sufficient. Having said that, all of our policies are open to discussion by our members and are reevaluated as necessary. And certainly to the extent that a member wants to bring that forward, they can. Personally, I haven't heard anyone raise it, any of our members raise it. We do have a board meeting coming up in 2 weeks though, so who knows, but I haven't heard it.
Okay, we've got one last question here. Who should we talk to attract China investment in new mills in our community?
I'm pausing because I'm thinking of the right answer. We don't have a specific contact for that. I have heard, we've been contacted by a number of Chinese entities asking about, that they're interested in investment. We have not been contacted though by any paper mills specifically, I don't believe. But I would reach out to any relationships they already have pre-existing in China. And certainly if whoever asked the question wants to talk to me offline, I'd be happy to talk further about that.
Okay, thank you, Robin. Okay, we're going to wrap it up right now, and great questions, everybody. And so we're going to log off now. So thank you for joining us. We hope you'll join us for the next National Recycling Coalition Quarterly Markets Development Networking webinar, which I mentioned before is scheduled for the week of September 24th. Please visit the NRC and RMC websites for the schedule updates. And have a great day, everybody, and thank you again, Robin.
Thank you.
So long.